Hello and welcome to this video. In the previous video, we talked about some of the give and takes surrounding development, but now we'll take a deeper look into a subtype of development that's been of increasing interest in recent years, affordable housing. So what is affordable housing? The technical definition of affordable housing is housing on which the occupant is paying no more than 30% of their gross income for housing costs, including utilities. So the definition is income neutral and is not synonymous with low income housing. However, since it naturally follows that wealthier individuals are more easily able to afford places to live, affordable housing policies, at least as many people think of it, is focused on providing housing for lower income people that are struggling to find and afford it. While it's certainly true that many current government programs and nonprofits are attempting to help those worse off, this has led to the misconception that affordable housing is only for the poor. More recently, though, the housing crisis that's spreading beyond the poor and working class and into the middle class appears to be slowly changing the perception of what affordable housing is in the public mind. So, whether it's about low wage workers struggling to make rent, younger adults wanting to purchase their first home, or seniors wanting to age in place on their defined income, affordable housing has become a major issue throughout the United States, including Marion County and Indianapolis. The topic of affordable housing, including its history, the cause of the current housing crisis, and potential solutions for easing it, are complicated and can be approached from a variety of different professions, each with their own unique perspective. This class isn't intended to be an exhaustive review of this very complicated topic, but rather to provide you with a high-level understanding. Before we talk about current tools, policies, and contributing causes behind the affordable housing crisis, we'll be spending some time looking at the history of affordable housing public policy. A small note before we get underway, it's important to understand that these policies did not in fact benefit all Americans. In another of our PPA classes, we'll be talking in more detail about some of the US's discriminatory policies, but for the purposes of this section, when we are reviewing history, anytime this little star shows up next to the title of a policy, it means that the benefit was only extended to white residents. And anytime you see the other character, the little exponent symbol, it means that the policy was explicitly segregationist, often working to create segregation where it didn't exist beforehand. The federal government's role in providing public housing goes as far back as World War I. So the war itself, and especially after the US announced that it would be joining in 1917, led to a boom in wartime production around military bases. The dramatic increases in workers that were necessary to build these supplies all led to an equally enormous housing shortage. And the United States Housing Corporation was created to provide housing for these workers. Though it only lasted a few years until the end of the war, the USHC created entire neighborhoods and provided housing for tens of thousands of workers. The next time the federal government would play a strong role in public housing would be during the Great Depression, as part of the New Deal program launched by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Housing insecurity and shortages were a major issue throughout the Great Depression. So in 1934, the National Housing Act created the Federal Housing Administration and made home ownership more affordable by having the government insure mortgages and also worked to improve the standards of housing. This was followed in 1937 with the US Housing Act, which allowed the government to create public housing for the first time since World War I. Local public housing authorities, or PHAs, were created at this time. With the onset of World War II, the GI Bill was passed in 1944 to help veterans upon returning home. Part of the benefits of the GI Bill was providing low-cost home mortgages, and through it, the Veterans Administration guaranteed over 4 million home loans. While this translated to great prosperity for people who were able to get these loans, it also contributed to a period of white flight and suburbanization. The Housing Act of 1949 reauthorized the 1937 Act and expanded construction of public housing, leading to a boom in public units. It also intensified and expanded policies known as slum clearance, which led to mass displacement. At the same time that additional public housing was being built, this act also increased authorization for the Federal Housing Administration to expand mortgage insurance. In 1965, the Housing and Urban Development Act created the Department of Housing and Urban Development, a cabinet-level agency also known as HUD. This act also began the practice of providing subsidies to local public housing agencies to help make up the difference between revenue from rents and maintenance costs. And in 1968, the Fair Housing Act was passed. Though the Civil Rights Act had been passed 4 years earlier in 1964 and had ended segregation in public places, agencies had ruled that the law did not apply to housing. So in 1968, the Fair Housing Act was passed by Congress, expanding the 1964 Act and making it illegal for banks to deny Black families home loans, for private citizens to refuse to sell to African Americans, and ending the practice of explicitly segregated public housing. This act also banned the construction of high-rise public housing developments for families with children. However, at the same time that explicit segregation was banned, other sections of the act limited the enforcement ability of HUD to counter forms of racism in housing which were not explicit. And in the now infamous Section 235 of this act, it began a shift away from funding public housing and to instead subsidizing mortgages for low-income earners. However, this program was plagued with discrimination, fraud, and abuse, and again furthered white flight and segregation. In 1973, President Nixon announced a moratorium on numerous federal level housing programs, including the construction of public housing, subsidized housing, and low-income mortgage assistance. This moratorium marks a major transition away from federal level programming for housing and instead devolving that authority to state and local governments. And in 1974, the Housing and Community Development Act was passed. This created the Community Development Block Grant Program, also known as CDBG. This program provides annual grants to states, cities, and counties to help them provide housing and expand economic opportunities for low and moderate income people. It also created the Section 8 program, which provides housing vouchers which low-income households can use to provide rental assistance for homes owned by private landlords. However, private landlords often did and have opted out of the program, refusing to accept the vouchers and leading to a shortage of places where those using the vouchers can live. In response to rising homelessness rates throughout the 80s, the Tax Reform Act of 1986 created the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, also known as LIHTC. This program is administered by the state and allocates tax credits to developers to allow them to build housing for low-income individuals. And in 1990, the National Affordable Housing Act, also known as the Cranston-Gonzalez Act, created the HOME program, which provides funds to rehabilitate as well as construct housing for both rental and home ownership. And in 1999, the Faircloth Amendment capped the number of public housing units to their 1999 level. So from this point onward, HUD can only replace existing units on a one-for-one basis. So that was really just a crash course looking specifically at federal policies and acts that affected affordable housing. Hopefully you have a better understanding of how public policy regarding affordable housing in the US at the federal level has evolved. I want to take a moment though to emphasize that this looks specifically at government and even more narrowly at the federal government, and that there are many nonprofits and community activists that have fought for people regarding this issue. If you want one example of a person who made an enormous impact, I recommend that you listen to the podcast about Dorothy Mae Richardson, which I've included as an optional resource for this module. So from here, we're going to talk briefly about some of the contributing factors behind the affordable housing crisis before looking at some of the tools and policies that aim to alleviate it. There are two primary mechanisms for contributing causes behind housing affordability. The first is a supply issue. The supply of existing homes has not kept pace with demand. A recent analysis completed by the mortgage finance company Freddie Mac concluded that the US housing market is 3.8 million single family homes short of what is needed to meet the country's demand. And the National Association of Realtors recently announced that the existing inventory of homes that are available on the market is the lowest that it's ever been since it began collecting the data in the late 1990s. A decreased supply of houses means greater competition for the existing stock, which drives prices up. And at the same time that real prices for homes and rent are going up, median real wages, that is, once you account for inflation, are not keeping pace with that rising cost of housing. So there are two contributing issues. We're going to focus on the supply side of the problem, as that is something we have some control over at the local level. So one of the limiters of supply are policies that work to reduce the density of housing. Only allowing for single family unattached housing means that it doesn't allow for other types of units such as townhomes, quads, and certainly not apartments. And then stacked on top of that, at times the zoning would further restrict the amount of units that could be built within those standards by establishing minimum lot sizes or square footage requirements for homes. So basically only allowing one family to live on a very large lot of land. These policies, which began during the 40s as suburbanization and white flight began, have over the decades contributed to housing shortages, especially in areas where there's no longer any additional land to develop. However, even in areas where there is undeveloped land to build on, such as in Marion County, new housing products are more expensive now due to rising costs in land, labor, and supplies. So where does that leave us today? What are some of the policies that are in place and additional tools that can be deployed to help? We're going to look at local public policy, federal programs, and some alternative housing models. So first, just as local public policies once worked to limit the amount of housing available, reversing those decisions is crucial. So for example, in Marion County, our land use plan at one time made rigid recommendations such as low density residential, which again did not allow for anything other than those single family unattached houses. In contrast, our pattern book with its current typologies is a lot more flexible and allows for different types of housing. And of course, in addition to changing the land use plan, changes to zoning ordinance have also been made, and we are continuing to update to once again allow for the inclusion of what's been called the missing middle housing. These are types of housing that was popular for a long time until zoning ordinances began banning them in practice, if not explicitly. So housing, again, like duplexes, fourplexes, and courtyard buildings, which add density in homes for more people and easily blend into existing neighborhoods of single family housing. We also have quite a few different federal programs that are in use today. As I'm sure you noticed in the history section, there's been a marked transition away from the use of public housing, and the Section 8 housing voucher program waiting lists often have thousands of people in line, and people will wait years in order to receive one. So neither of these programs are a major focus for the federal government. Instead, we'll be looking at three programs that are among the most popular and are administered at the local level. And these are Community Development Block Grants, AKA CDBG, Home, and Low Income Housing Tax Credits, also known as LIHTC. All three of these were mentioned briefly when we were going through the history of affordable housing, and now we'll be taking a closer look at them. First, CDBG. Each year for CDBG, the federal government through HUD distributes money to participating local governments called entitlement communities, as well as providing money to the state for areas that are not one of these entitlement communities. Marion County is one of these communities, so we receive funding every year, and organizations in turn come up with projects and apply for those funds. So essentially, the federal government distributes the money to localities, and we in turn distribute the money to nonprofits and the like to accomplish these projects. CDBG is one of the most flexible programs, and it's used for a variety of housing and social services like low-income home repair, public facility construction, and employment training. One of the primary criteria of CDBG is that it has to benefit low and moderate income persons. There are some variations depending on additional criteria, but programs funded by CDBG set income limits, which are typically 80% of the area median income. For the Indianapolis metropolitan area, the income limit for a single person household is $45,951. And then we also have HOME, which, similar to CDBG, has HUD distribute money to participating local governments, which in turn distribute it to local organizations via an application process. HOME, as you may have assumed based on its acronym, is more narrowly focused on housing than CDBG, with an overall goal of creating safe, affordable housing for low-income households for both rental and homeownership. So as a comparison between the two, the primary way that CDBG money helps specifically with affordable housing is by providing owner-occupied repair. In contrast, HOME provides services like down payment assistance and new construction, and in general is more focused on providing housing options in a variety of different ways. And then we have LIHTC, or low-income housing tax credits. These are allocated by the Internal Revenue Service and are administered at the state level rather than the local. So here in Indiana, the Indiana Housing and Community Development Authority, or IHCDA, oversees that program. The low-income housing tax program is the federal government's primary policy tool for encouraging the development and rehabilitation of affordable rental housing. The program awards developers federal tax credits. That is, they reduce the amount of tax you owe to offset construction costs in exchange for agreeing to reserve a certain number of the units for low-income households for the next 30 years. So a benefit of the program is that it works to increase the supply of rental units in general, in addition to creating specifically affordable units, but the affordability component only lasts 30 years. And finally, before we leave today, there are a couple unique approaches to affordable housing that I wanted to mention that lay outside of public policy. So first is the Community Land Trust, or CLT. In this model, a nonprofit works to provide perpetual affordability by keeping ownership of the land. So these organizations, when they sell a house to someone, they are only selling the physical building rather than the building and land combined. This is because a large part of what fuels big jumps in home prices is the land it sits on. So by taking that out of the equation, it helps maintain affordability. So when the owner sells, they are only selling the home itself, helping to keep prices affordable. And the second are housing cooperatives, also known as co-ops. So co-ops are typically multifamily units or units that have a shared common space. So in this model, the owners in a co-op are actually shareholders rather than owners. The benefits are that rather than paying a profit margin to a landlord on top of the expense, co-ops operate on an at-cost basis. So you are only being charged as much as it takes to maintain the units and amenities. So these are just a few of the many policies and programs that are in place working to help alleviate the affordable housing crisis. But it's important to keep in mind that no single strategy or policy will solve this problem. Just as there are many factors that contribute to the problem, there is no silver bullet that will solve it. Instead, we continue to innovate, adapt, and work towards improving our communities. Thank you for watching.